The most memorable line said by Coldhands is probably, "Your monster, Brandon Stark." But I think a lot of A Song of Ice and Fire fans actually misremember something important about this line. You will often see conversations about Coldhands being Bran's monster and trying to figure out what exactly that means that Coldhands is Bran's monster. I was even asked that same question recently on a live stream, and my answer was that I don't think Coldhands is Bran's monster. The way that I read it, I think it's fairly clear he's talking about someone else who is Bran's monster. We're going to go through all the context and what leads up to this conversation in this video, but the way that I read it, they are calling Coldhands a monster throughout the chapter, but this specific line that's talking about Bran's monster is definitely referring to someone else. So here's the actual line in context. Mira asks, "Who sent you? Who is this three-eyed crow?" A friend, dreamer, wizard, call him what you will. The last green seer. The long hall's wooden door banged open. Outside the night wind howled bleak and black. The trees were full of ravens screaming. Coldhands did not move. "A monster," said Bran. The ranger looked at Bran as if the rest of them did not exist. "Your monster, Brandon Stark." "Yours," the raven echoed from his shoulder. Outside the door, the ravens in the trees took up the cry until the night wood echoed to the murderous song of "Yours, yours, yours." "Jojen, did you dream this?" Mira asked her brother. "Who is he? What is he? What do we do now?" "We go with the ranger," said Jojen. "We have come too far to turn back now, Mira. We would never make it back to the wall alive. We go with Bran's monster, or we die." So, in context here, they've been traveling for a long time to meet with this three-eyed crow who's reaching out to Bran and Jojen in dreams. And Mira asks Coldhands, because he's been sent by the three-eyed crow, like, "Okay, who exactly sent you? What is this three-eyed crow?" And Coldhands says he's a friend, a dreamer, a wizard, call him what you will. And Bran responds, "A monster." And he's talking about the three-eyed crow. In the text, there's a little bit of a break in the conversation to talk about how the door bangs open and the wind is blowing in and Coldhands is sitting still, but Bran saying "a monster" is a direct response to Coldhands saying "call him what you will." So, removing all the environmental descriptions and things like that, the conversation back and forth goes, "Who sent you? Who is this three-eyed crow?" "A friend, a dreamer, a wizard, call him what you will." Bran says, "A monster," and Coldhands says, "Your monster, Brandon Stark." Then Mira asks, "Jojen, did you dream this? What do we do now?" And Jojen says, "We go with the ranger. We've come too far, we're not going to make it back to the wall alive. We go with Bran's monster or we die." So even in that last sentence, Jojen refers to the ranger and Bran's monster separately. I think this definitely does trip some people up, though, that he says, "We go with the ranger," and then he says, "We go with Bran's monster." But given the context of the rest of the conversation, he seems to be referring to two different entities, the ranger and Bran's monster separately. They're going to meet and stay with Bran's monster, or they're going to die, but the ranger is the one taking them there. So when you actually look at this conversation, it's fairly clear that Coldhands is not talking about himself when he says "your monster, Brandon Stark." They're all talking about the three-eyed crow being Bran's monster, and now we just need to figure out why exactly the three-eyed crow is Bran's monster. And I do think it also just makes sense on a grander level as well about Bran's story that the three-eyed crow would be his monster. That's the one that Bran's entire story has been leading him towards meeting, whereas Coldhands is just a guide for part of the way there. So the three-eyed crow being the one that is in fact Bran's monster just on an overall level also does just make more sense. But then again, we're still left to piece together what exactly that means to say that the three-eyed crow is Bran's monster. It certainly is interesting that Coldhands, who is seemingly working for the Three-Eyed Crow and bringing them to the Three-Eyed Crow, would refer to the guy as "your monster." Now, probably the least interesting reason that he could have done this is just because it's the snappy, cool thing to say when Bran refers to him as a monster. He may not actually think of the three-eyed crow as a monster, evidenced by him saying a friend, a dreamer, and a wizard, but it is a snappy little comeback to say your monster when Bran calls him a monster. Sort of like if you do something stupid or mess something up and your husband or wife says, "Oh, you idiot," and you say, "At least I'm your idiot." Like, you don't actually think of yourself as an idiot, it's just a funny little response to say in the moment. A bit of banter, if you will. Coldhands may not need to eat, sleep, or breathe, but that doesn't mean he can't make jokes. And as I said, I do think we have some evidence that he doesn't necessarily view the three-eyed crow as a monster because he calls him things that are much nicer, a friend, a dreamer, a wizard, and the last green seer. But Bran, I think, has some decent reason to suspect that the three-eyed crow is some sort of monster. If we remember back to Bran's early interactions with the three-eyed crow, they were rather scary, including the dream where the crow shows up and starts pecking at Bran's forehead and tells him to fly or die as he's crashing down from thousands of miles in the air, and he's gonna hit the ground if he doesn't learn to fly. We've also seen the three-eyed crow pecking at Bran's head and straight up manipulating his memory so that he doesn't remember who threw him from the tower. It's pretty reasonable for a child to think that the weird creature invading his dreams and making them scary and telling him to fly or die, manipulating his life and manipulating his memories, doing all of this crazy stuff, calling that thing a monster does make quite a bit of sense. The other reason it makes sense for Bran is because he's been constantly told stories about how beyond the wall is where the monsters live. The word monster is used 15 times in all of Bran's chapters in the books. The first three are referring to the dire wolves as monsters, then there's a reference to the game Monsters and Maidens, and then there's someone calling Ramsay Bolton a monster. So that takes care of the first third of the times that the word is used. After that, it's used twice when Bran is being told the story of the Night of the Laughing Tree. This one definitely has some potential relevance. When he's being told the story, he says, "This isn't going to be one of those love stories, is it?" Hodor doesn't like those so much. He likes the stories where knights fight monsters. And he's told, "Sometimes the knights are the monsters, Bran." So we'll come back to that, but that gets us to 7 of the 15 uses of the word. The next 3 all come in the chapter where they meet Sam coming up through the Black Gate. And the first one is when they get to the wall and Bran's thinking about how he wants to be able to climb to the top of the wall and look out over it, and he thinks about how it was the end of the world, old Nan always said. On the other side were monsters and giants and ghouls, but they could not pass so long as the wall stood strong. Later on in the chapter, when Sam comes up through the Black Gate, Bran notes how he's just a guy in black, he's not a monster, expecting a monster to be the thing coming up out of the well. Sam explains that he and Gilly were sent up by Coldhands to basically send them down the well to go meet with Coldhands, and Mira asks, "Why didn't he come with you? They came with you, why not him? Why didn't you bring him through this Black Gate too?" And Sam says, he can't." Mira says, "Why not?" And Sam says, "The wall. The wall is more than just ice and stone," he said. "There are spells woven into it, old ones and strong. He cannot pass beyond the wall." It grew very quiet in the castle kitchen then. Bran could hear the soft crackle of the flames, the wind stirring the leaves in the night, the creak of the skinny weirwood reaching for the moon. Beyond the gates the monsters live, and the giants and the ghouls, he remembered old Nan saying, but they cannot pass so long as the wall stands strong. So go to sleep, my little Brandon, my baby boy. You needn't fear. There are no monsters here. So that chapter gets us 3 more uses of the word monster, technically 4 if you want to count every single time the word is used. When you search on A Search of Ice and Fire, it shows you each paragraph in which the word is used, and there are 15 paragraphs in which it's used. The specific word is used 20 times overall if you count it appearing multiple times in one paragraph. Don't worry, you're going to see every time it's used either way. So each time, though, in this chapter in A Storm of Swords that we have the word monster used, it's seemingly in reference to the idea that old Nan told Bran stories of monsters that live beyond the wall. He thinks about it when he wants to look over the top of the wall. He thinks about it when Sam is coming up from the well because surely he must be one of these scary monsters. And then he thinks about it when they're told that Coldhands can't pass the wall, thinking that Coldhands must be one of the monsters. And this is definitely worth bringing up that in this context of monsters referring to these creepy, weird things beyond the wall, Coldhands is definitely a monster, and he is referred to as a monster in this context throughout the next book as well. And this is probably also going some way to explaining why so many people think of Coldhands as Bran's monster, because they do call him a monster. He's just not specifically Brandon Stark's monster. At least not in the context of the conversation in which that line is said. The next time that the word is used, we actually even get a direct reference to the idea that Coldhands is a monster who's taking Bran to another monster. This comes in Bran 1, A Dance with Dragons. They're talking about how Coldhands' scarf doesn't get cold and covered in ice because of his breath, and they realize that means he's not breathing. And Mira says, if he does not breathe, Bran found himself remembering the tales old Nan had told him when he was a babe. Beyond the wall the monsters live, the giants and the ghouls, the stalking shadows and the dead that walk, she would say, tucking him in beneath the scratchy woolen blanket. But they cannot pass so long as the wall stands strong and the men of the Night's Watch are true. So go to sleep, my little Brandon, my baby boy, and dream sweet dreams. There are no monsters here. The ranger wore the black of the Night's Watch, but what if he was not a man at all? What if he was some monster, taking them to the other monsters to be devoured? So George definitely does a little bit of refreshing our mind as to how Bran is viewing the situation, and he says basically the same line from Old Nan as he did in the last example we looked at, but that's because those were 2 books apart. So George is bringing us back into Bran's story and refreshing us on where Bran's head is at. The scary things beyond the wall are monsters, Coldhands is a monster, and he thinks he might be taking them to the other monsters to be devoured. So, again, Bran is viewing these scary things beyond the wall as monsters, for lack of a better word. All of the rest of the uses of the word monster in Bran's chapters come in that conversation we read at the very beginning and a little bit before that, so I'll read a little bit more of the context that leads into that conversation now. Essentially, Coldhands has suddenly showed up with some meat for them because they're starving on their way north, and he says that he killed a pig. But they quickly realize that he has actually killed members of the Night's Watch, those deserters who were at Craster's Keep. Mira turned the meat to cook the other side. Hodor was chewing and swallowing, muttering happily under his breath. Only Jojen seemed aware of what was happening as Coldhands turned his head to stare at Bran. They were foes. Men of the Night's Watch. You killed them, you and the ravens. Their faces were torn and their eyes were gone. Coldhands did not deny it. They were your brothers. I saw. The wolves had ripped their clothes up, but I could still tell. Their cloaks were black, like your hands. Coldhands said nothing. Who are you? Why are your hands black? The ranger studied his hands as if he had never noticed them before. Once the heart has ceased to beat, a man's blood runs down to his extremities, where it thickens and congeals. His voice rattled in his throat, as thin and gaunt as he was. His hands and feet swell up and turn as black as pudding. The rest of him becomes as white as milk. Mira Reed rose, her frog spear in hand, a chunk of smoking meat still impaled upon its tines. Show us your face. The ranger made no move to obey. He's dead. Bran could taste the bile in his throat. Mira, he's some dead thing. The monsters cannot pass so long as the wall stands and the men of the Night's Watch stay true. That's what old Nan used to say. He came to meet us at the wall, but he could not pass. He sent Sam instead with that wildling girl. Mira's gloved hand tightened around the shaft of her frog spear. Who sent you? Who is this three-eyed crow? A friend, dreamer, wizard, call him what you will. The last green seer. The long hall's wooden door banged open. Outside the night wind howled, bleak and black. The trees were full of ravens screaming. Coldhands did not move. A monster, said Bran. The ranger looked at Bran as if the rest of them did not exist. Your monster, Brandon Stark. So once again, Bran has realized Coldhands is a monster, he has called him a monster, but this specific line that leads to the words "your monster, Brandon Stark" are talking about the three-eyed crow. Bran is now realizing that the monsters beyond the wall he was told about are real, and not only that, but the person who he's being brought to meet is one of these monsters, and he has a monster working for him. Essentially, Bran is realizing that here beyond the wall he is surrounded by monsters, including the one who was reaching into his dreams and getting him to come up north because that monster couldn't go south himself. It's probably on some level hitting Bran that for the same reason Coldhands couldn't go through the Black Gate to retrieve them himself, this monster, the three-eyed crow, couldn't come south of the wall to talk to Bran other than in dreams. He needed Bran to go north of the wall to meet him. The reason for that must then be he is also some sort of monster who can't physically pass south of the wall. In this context, you could see Coldhand's response of, "Your monster, Brandon Stark," as basically just admitting that, yes, we are monsters. Look at the state I'm in, and you'll see the state that the three eyed crow is in. We are definitely monstrous, but I'm taking you to your monster, and you need to go meet him. I think this is a reasonable understanding of what Coldhands is saying here. He's essentially accepting the framing that they are monsters like the ones that Bran was told live beyond the wall. They're in a monstrous state. The things that they are doing are on some level monstrous, eating other people, manipulating Bran to get him north of the wall so that he can fulfill his prophetic dark destiny. All of these things that they're doing along with the state that they're in would definitely make monsters a accurate description. Who knows how far down this path of using these powers and manipulating the world Bran is going to go, but by the end of his story you could even potentially say Bran will be a monster himself. Given what we've already seen with Hodor and what we know is coming in the future with Hold the Door and Bran likely not only manipulating Hodor, he's probably going to go further than that, I think there's a pretty good chance that, yeah, by the end you could call Bran a monster in the same way that they're calling the three-eyed crow a monster here. In this case, that would mean that Bran's monster is the one who he needs to go and learn from so that he can become a bit of a monster in his own right in order to save the world. There is, however, one other interesting interpretation of this. I said we would return to the idea of the Night of the Laughing Tree story and how monster was used in those contexts, and Bran is saying Hodor likes the stories where knights fight monsters. What he really is saying is that he likes the stories where knights fight the monsters, and Bran himself always wanted to grow up to be a knight. In that context, the idea that they are going to meet Bran's monster, if Bran is the one who's going to grow up to be a metaphorical knight in this story, well, then he is going to have to potentially fight and maybe even slay that monster. If Bran is the metaphorical knight in this situation and he has to fight the monster and the three-eyed crow is Bran's monster, that could hint at a more antagonistic relationship between the two, where perhaps Bran is going to have to reject the three-eyed crow's plan for him eventually taking the power, but perhaps going in a different direction with it than his mentor is planning. For those of you who think that the three-eyed crow is perhaps luring Bran up to the cave so that he can body snatch him and put his consciousness into a younger, more powerful body and do more things and live longer and all that sort of stuff, if that is indeed the case, then him being described as Bran's monster that Bran will eventually have to fight, well, that would make a lot of sense. I don't personally think that Bloodraven is planning to body snatch Bran, but I definitely could see it being a twist that George was working towards. It, would make some sense with Bran being able to warg into Hodor. Perhaps the three-eyed crow thinks he can warg into Bran. So, if that is indeed part of the dark plan of manipulation that the three-eyed crow has going on here, yeah, that would make suddenly a lot of sense of this line that he is Bran's monster that Bran will need to fight. Overall, I think that those are the main ways that this could be going. The three-eyed crow is Bran's monster rather than Coldhands, and that either means that he is the monster that's going to eventually teach Bran to be a bit more monstrous so that he can do what he needs to do to save the world, or he is the monster that Bran is eventually going to be antagonistic towards and need to defeat, like a knight defeats the monsters in the stories. I would say of all the things that point towards an antagonistic three-eyed crow that Bran will need to eventually fight and defeat, this is probably one of the strongest bits of foreshadowing. The main question that remains then is whether it would be a better story for the three-eyed crow to be the potentially monstrous mentor that Bran's going to need to learn from to do what he needs to do, or if it would be a better twist for him to be the monster that Bran needs to defeat. Old Nan, who told Bran all the stories about the monsters living beyond the wall, also did say that crows are all liars when he told her about his crow dreams. So that definitely does feel relevant. But let me know what you guys think of any of that down there in the comments. Thank you very much for watching. Remember to like and subscribe before you go, and I'll be back with something else very soon.